Sign satisfaction now so we can finally get rid of you. Those were the exact words my husband said to me on Christmas Eve. I was 7 months pregnant, standing in my own living room, watching him slide divorce papers across the table, while his
Please
pregnant
keep her
mistress
safe.
sat on my couch,
Let her heartbeat
smiling.
stay strong.
His mother called me a
Please
parasite,
protect my
a
little
gold digger,
girl.
a placeholder wife. They threw me out into the snow like garbage. No car, no money, no phone, nothing but the baby kicking inside me and $14 in my pocket. But here's what nobody in that room knew. I was recording everything. They thought they had destroyed me. They thought I would crawl away and disappear. They were wrong. Because over the next 11 months, I discovered something that changed everything. The fake affair texts they used against me, I traced the payments. The medical records they stole, I found out who leaked them. And the baby his mistress was carrying, it was not his. But the biggest twist, the person who orchestrated my entire destruction was not who I thought. Stay until the end, because what I am about to tell you could save your life. Value statement. This is not just entertainment. This is a survival guide disguised as a story. Every woman who has ever been betrayed, underestimated, or thrown away will find herself in this journey. And the lessons Rachel learns about documentation, about legal rights, about refusing to beg for love from people who see you as disposable, these are lessons that could change everything for you. Meaning of the story. This story carries one powerful truth. Your worth was never determined by who recognized it. Your worth was always there. You just have to stop letting people who do not deserve you convince you it is not. The greatest revenge is not making them suffer. The greatest revenge is building a life so full of purpose that they become nothing but a footnote in your story. You are enough. You have always been enough, and anyone who makes you feel otherwise has already disqualified themselves from your life. 11 months ago, my husband handed me divorce papers while his pregnant girlfriend sat on my couch. His mother called me a parasite. They thought they were throwing out garbage. They did not know I was recording. They did not know about the offshore account, and they definitely did not know that the baby Brittany was carrying was not David's. This is the story of how I went from begging my husband to stay to watching him beg me for mercy. But here's what I need you to understand. I am not rich. I am not connected. I am a billing specialist who makes $52,000 a year. Everything I did, you can do too. Stay with me until the end, because the person who destroyed my marriage was not who I thought. My name is Rachel Coleman, and this is how I learned that rock bottom is not a destination. It is a foundation. The snow fell thick and heavy over suburban Ohio on December 23rd, coating our modest two-story house in a layer of pristine white. I stood in the living room, 7 months pregnant, wrestling with a string of Christmas lights that had somehow tangled themselves into an impossible knot. My phone was tucked under my chin, my mother's voice crackling through the speaker from her retirement community in Florida. She asked if David was helping me decorate. I laughed and looked over at my husband, sprawled on the couch with a beer in one hand and the remote in the other. The television was blaring some football game I did not care about. I told her he was supervising. From the couch, with football. My mother made that sound she always makes when she is trying not to say something critical. She said that man would supervise his way out of his own funeral. I laughed again, but the truth was, she was right. David had been distant lately, working late almost every night, coming home tired and irritable, barely looking at me when I talked to him. I told myself it was stress. His job in medical device sales was demanding. The holidays were always hectic. And with the baby coming in 2 months, we were both under pressure. I apologized to my mother for not being able to fly down for Christmas. I told her with the pregnancy this far along The doctor did not want me traveling. She said she understood. She asked if I was taking care of myself. She reminded me that I had a tendency to take care of everyone else first. I promised her I was fine. I apologized for worrying her. I apologized for not calling more often. I apologized for the spotty phone connection. 3 apologies in 1 conversation. That was my pattern. Apologizing for existing. Apologizing for taking up space. Apologizing for having needs. I did not realize it then, but that pattern was about to cost me everything. After I hung up with my mother, I finished decorating the tree by myself. David never moved from the couch. I made his favorite dinner, pot roast with mashed potatoes and gravy. He picked at it, checked his phone every 30 seconds, and said he was not hungry because he had eaten at the office. I ate alone at the kitchen table, listening to the television drone on in the other room, feeling the baby kick against my ribs. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones. But every time I tried to ask David about it, he made me feel like I was being paranoid, like I was being needy, like I was the problem. The next morning, Christmas Eve, his mother called. Linda Coleman had never liked me. Oh, she was never openly hostile. She was far too refined for that. But there was always a slight edge to her voice when she spoke to me, a tiny sigh of disappointment, a raised eyebrow at my clearance rack clothes, or my coupon clipping, or my practical, sensible approach to money. Linda asked if I needed help with tomorrow's dinner. She said she knew it was a lot for me in my condition. She emphasized that last word like pregnancy was some kind of shameful disease. I told her I had it handled. I thanked her anyway. She sighed, that tiny, barely audible sigh that managed to communicate volumes of disappointment. She said, of course I did. She said I was so independent. She said David was just saying the other day how I never let anyone help me. She said it worried him. I felt my stomach clench. I asked her what she meant. I asked her if David had said something to her about me. She backtracked immediately, her voice turning sweet as honey. She said, oh, it was nothing. She said pregnancy hormones probably made everything feel bigger than it was. She said when she was pregnant with David, she was so emotional she could not think straight for months. I felt vaguely insulted, but could not pinpoint exactly why. That was Linda's specialty, making you feel small without ever saying anything you could point to as obviously cruel. She mentioned she was bringing a surprise guest to Christmas dinner, someone David had been wanting me to meet, work-related. I should have asked more questions. I should have pressed for details. I should have listened to the alarm bells ringing in the back of my mind. But I was tired. I was pregnant. I was busy trying to prepare the perfect Christmas dinner to prove to Linda that I belonged in her family. So I said that sounded nice. I said I would set an extra place at the table. I apologized for not having more appetizers prepared. Another apology. Another small piece of myself surrendered to keep the peace. That evening, I put on my nicest maternity dress, a deep green velvet that had cost more than I usually spent on clothes. I curled my hair. I put on makeup for the first time in weeks. I wanted to look beautiful for my husband. I wanted to make him proud. The doorbell rang at 6:00 sharp. I opened it with a smile already forming on my face, ready to welcome my in-laws for what I thought would be a pleasant family Christmas. David walked in first. He did not look at me. He did not smile. He did not wish me Merry Christmas. Behind him came Linda, dressed in an elegant burgundy suit with pearls at her throat. Then Robert, David's father, a small, quiet man who seemed to shrink smaller every year. And behind them walked a woman I had never seen before. She was young, maybe 28 or 29. Blonde hair, sharp cheekbones. The kind of calculated beauty that came from expensive salons and careful attention. She was also visibly pregnant. About 5 months along, the smile froze on my face. My hand gripped the door frame so hard my knuckles went white. David finally looked at me. His eyes were cold, empty, like he was looking at a stranger. He said he was going to wait until after the holidays, but his mother thought it was better to just rip off the Band-Aid. Linda stepped forward, her voice dripping with false sympathy. She said it was kinder this way. Dragging it out only hurt everyone, especially the children. Children, plural. David reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope. He walked past me into the living room and dropped it on the coffee table. He told me to sign it. He said his lawyer had drawn up custody papers. If I signed now, I could have supervised visits. If I fought it, things could get ugly. I picked up the envelope with shaking hands. I pulled out the documents inside. Petition for dissolution of marriage, custody agreement, my husband's signature already on every page. Just waiting for mine. I looked at the blonde woman standing in my living room. I asked who she was. She looked confused, almost apologetic. She said her name was Brittany. She said she was sorry. She said she thought I knew. She said David told her we had an arrangement. Linda stepped between us, her smile sharp as broken glass. She said they knew about my affair. She said 6 months of messages. She pulled out her phone and showed me screenshots of text conversations between someone named Rachel and someone named Jason. Explicit messages, plans to meet, promises to leave our spouses. I had never heard of anyone named Jason. I had never sent those messages. I had never cheated on my husband. But the messages were from my phone number. The words sounded like something I might say. The screenshots looked completely real. I tried to speak. I tried to defend myself. I tried to explain that I had no idea what they were talking about. But Linda cut me off. She said they were done pretending. She said they were done accepting charity cases into their family. She said I had been bleeding David dry since the day we met. She said everyone could see it except David himself, who had been too blinded by whatever cheap tricks I had used to seduce him. Her voice dropped to a hiss that only I could hear. She said I should have known this was coming. She said women like me always ended up alone. She said I was nothing special, nothing memorable, nothing worth keeping. She said I had been a placeholder, a practice wife, a temporary amusement until someone better came along. I looked at David, the man I had loved for 6 years, the man who had promised to cherish me, the father of my child. He would not meet my eyes. I asked him if any of it was real, our relationship, our marriage, our baby. He shrugged. He said things changed. He said he realized he made a mistake. He said I did not understand his world or his ambitions or his needs. He said I was holding him back. He pointed at Brittany. He said she understood him. She supported him. She was the partner he needed. I felt something break inside me. Not my heart, something deeper, something fundamental. Linda pushed the papers toward me. She told me to sign them. She said to make this easy on everyone, including myself. She said to take whatever David was offering and disappear. And I signed. I know what you are thinking. How could you sign? How could you give up without a fight? How could you let them win? But you have to understand. I was in shock. I was 7 months pregnant. I was surrounded by hostile people in my own home with no one on my side. I was shown evidence of an affair I did not commit with no way to prove my innocence. I was told my entire marriage was a lie. I signed because I could not think. I signed because I could not breathe. I signed because some desperate part of me believed that if I just did what they wanted, the nightmare would stop. Looking back, I can tell you this. Never sign anything in the moment, especially not with witnesses who are hostile to you, especially not when you are in shock. The words I need time to review this with my own counsel are the most important words you can learn. I did not know them. Now you do. Linda took the papers from me with a satisfied smile. She told me to leave my keys on the table. She checked her watch and announced they had dinner reservations at 8, and I was making them late. 20 minutes later, I was standing on the sidewalk outside my own house with a small suitcase that Linda had helpfully packed for me. My keys had been taken. My car was in David's name. My phone was almost dead. It was Christmas Eve, snow was falling, and I had nowhere to go. I walked for 2 hours through the empty streets of suburban Ohio, my thin coat offering no protection against the bitter December wind. The maternity dress that had made me feel so beautiful 3 hours ago now felt like a costume from a play I no longer understood. My phone died after the first hour. I had managed to leave one voicemail for Marcus, my coworker at the hospital, and one text to my mother that I was not sure actually sent before the screen went black. I found a gas station that was still open. I used the $14 in my wallet to buy a cheap phone charger and a cup of bitter coffee. I sat in my car in the parking lot, except I did not have a car anymore. I sat on a bench outside the gas station in the snow on Christmas Eve, and I watched my phone slowly come back to life. No calls, no texts, no one looking for me. I tried the women's shelter. The recording said they were at capacity due to holiday overflow. I tried 2 motels. Both wanted deposits I could not afford. I tried calling my mother again, still no answer. She went to bed early these days. Around 11 at night, I found a 24-hour laundromat on a side street downtown. The warmth hit me like an embrace when I walked through the door. The air smelled like fabric softener and old coins. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. I sat down in a plastic chair and I cried. I cried for my marriage. I cried for my baby. I cried for the woman I thought I was and the future I thought I had. I cried until I had nothing left, until I was just an empty shell sitting in a laundromat on Christmas Eve. And then my baby kicked. A small flutter of movement, like butterfly wings against my ribs. My daughter, reminding me she was still there, still counting on me, still needing me to be strong. I put my hand on my belly, and I made myself stop crying. I was going to be her example. Was I going to show her that women lay down and accept whatever men decide? Or was I going to show her how to fight? I did not know how to fight yet, but I was about to learn. I fell asleep in that laundromat, curled up on a bench with my coat as a pillow. I woke up on Christmas morning to find a blanket draped over me and a cup of tea sitting on the chair beside me. An older woman with gray hair and kind eyes was folding laundry nearby. She introduced herself as Mrs. Patterson. She said she owned the place. She said she had come in early to check on things and found me sleeping. She did not ask questions. She did not demand explanations. She just handed me a muffin from her purse and told me to eat something for the baby. That small kindness broke through my numbness. In the middle of the worst night of my life, a stranger had shown me more compassion than my own husband. Around noon, my phone finally rang. It was Marcus. His voice exploded through the speaker like a force of nature. He demanded to know where I was. He said he had gotten my message. He said he had been calling all morning. He demanded to know what happened. I told him everything. By the end, I was crying again. Marcus did not let me cry for long. He said, "Girl, where are you?" He said, "Do not move." He said he was coming. 45 minutes later, his beat-up Honda pulled into the laundromat parking lot. Marcus Thompson climbed out wearing a Christmas sweater with a cat on it, looking like an avenging angel in holiday attire. He took one look at me and said, "Oh, hell no." He said we were going to his place. He said I was going to eat his mama's leftover ham. He said then I was going to tell him everything so he could figure out how not to catch a case today. Marcus's apartment was small but warm. His mother Gloria was waiting for us, a tiny woman in her 80s with eyes that missed nothing. She had already set a place for me at the table. She watched me eat for a full 5 minutes before she spoke. She said, "So your man brought his side piece to Christmas dinner and made you sign papers." She shook her head slowly. She said in her day they would have handled that differently. She asked if I had a cast iron skillet. Marcus groaned. He said, "Mama, we are not assaulting anyone." Gloria held up her hands innocently. She said she did not say assault. She said conversation, with a skillet nearby. I almost laughed. It felt strange, laughing after the worst night of my life. But something about Gloria's fierce maternal energy made me feel for the first time like maybe I was not completely alone. After dinner, Marcus sat me down with a notebook and a pen. He said, "First thing, I needed to document everything." He said, "Write down every conversation, every date, every dollar." He said, "Courts love paper trails." I told him I did not have money for a lawyer. He leaned forward, his expression serious. He said, "Baby girl, there is legal aid. There is pro bono. There are law school clinics where students need cases." He said being broke does not mean being helpless. It means being creative. Then he said something that changed everything for me. He said the system is not fair, but it has rules. Learn the rules better than they do, and the system becomes your weapon. I wrote that down in my notebook. I underlined it twice. Over the next few days, I started taking stock of my situation. What I had lost was substantial. My home, which was in David's name. My car, also in David's name. Most of our savings, which he had already moved from our joint account. And apparently my reputation, thanks to those fake text messages. What I had was less impressive, but not nothing. My job at the hospital, assuming I still had it when I went back after the holidays. My brain trained by 8 years of billing work to find discrepancies and follow paper trails. $847 in my personal savings account. One friend willing to help me, and 7 weeks until my due date. It was not much, but it was something, and I was going to use every single bit of it. The day after Christmas, I went to the courthouse. I filed an emergency motion to vacate the custody agreement I had signed on Christmas Eve. I did it myself. Pro se, which means representing yourself. The filing fee was waived because of my income level. The clerk, a woman named Janet, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner, helped me fill out the forms. She was not supposed to give legal advice, but she pointed me toward box 14B and said I might want to check that one. It requested that the other party prove the authenticity of any evidence they submitted. I checked box 14B. The hearing was scheduled for the first week of January. I told myself this was the beginning of the end. I would go to court, explain what happened, and the judge would see the truth. The nightmare would be over. I had no idea how wrong I was. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Wood-paneled walls, fluorescent lights, an American flag in the corner. It looked less like the dramatic settings I had seen on television and more like a slightly upgraded conference room. I sat at one table, alone, wearing the most professional outfit I could assemble from my limited wardrobe. David sat at the other table with his lawyer, a slick man in an expensive suit who kept checking his gold watch like he had somewhere more important to be. The judge was an older man with tired eyes. He listened as I explained what happened. The Christmas Eve ambush. The divorce papers shoved across the table. The pregnant mistress sitting on my couch. The fake text messages I had never seen before. The pressure to sign immediately without legal counsel. David's lawyer tried to paint me as a hysterical woman making excuses. He said I had signed the papers voluntarily. He said no one had held a gun to my head. He said I was an adult capable of making my own decisions, but I had done my homework. I presented my phone records, which I had requested from my carrier for $25. The records showed that the affair texts were sent during times when I was at work, on the hospital network, with my personal phone locked in my locker. The texts were spoofed. Someone had faked them. I presented screenshots of our joint bank account showing payments to a company called TextSecure, a text spoofing service, starting 3 months before Christmas. The judge's eyebrows rose. He looked at David with new skepticism. He ruled that the custody agreement was suspended pending further investigation. I retained full parental rights. David was ordered to provide documentation proving the authenticity of the text messages. I walked out of that courtroom feeling hope for the first time in weeks. I called my mother. She cried with relief. I called Marcus. He whooped so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. I thought I had won. I thought the worst was over. I had no idea the war was just beginning. 3 days after my court victory, I came back to Marcus's apartment to find my belongings on the curb. A man in a cheap suit was standing by the door. He introduced himself as a housing inspector. He said someone had filed a complaint that Marcus was harboring an unregistered tenant in violation of his Section 8 assistance agreement. If the complaint was substantiated, Marcus would lose his housing assistance. He would not be able to afford the apartment on his own. I checked the public records later. The complaint had been filed anonymously, but the timestamp was 8 minutes after my court victory was recorded in the system. Linda Coleman. It had to be. I looked at Marcus, who was standing in the doorway with his mother, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. I told him I was so sorry. I told him this was my fault. I told him I would leave immediately. Marcus shook his head. He said this was not my fault. This was their fault. He said they were trying to isolate me, cut off my support system, make me desperate enough to give up. But he could not risk losing his housing. Not with Gloria depending on him. So I left. I found a budget motel that charged by the week. I used most of my remaining savings for the first week's rent. I sat on the thin mattress in the tiny room and I wondered how much worse things could get. The answer was much worse. A week later, I got called into the human resources office at the hospital. My supervisor, Karen, was sitting behind her desk with an expression I recognized. The same expression she wore when she had to fire someone. Sympathetic, but determined. She said they had received complaints. Multiple complaints from patients claiming I had made billing errors that resulted in overcharges. I had been in billing for 8 years. My error rate was the lowest in the department. Karen said she knew it seemed wrong, but the complaints were documented, specific dates and amounts. They had to investigate. I was placed on administrative leave, with pay for now, but my building access was revoked immediately. I drove back to my motel room and I put the pieces together. David worked in medical device sales. His company had contracts with hospitals, including my hospital. His company had recently won a contract with the orthopedic department. Suddenly, David had friends in administration, friends who could file complaints, friends who could make my life very difficult. That night, in my motel room, I let myself fall apart. I cried until I had nothing left. I thought about giving up, not on life, but on fighting. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was not equipped for this. Maybe I should just sign whatever they wanted and accept that I had lost. Then I felt my daughter kick, and I got angry, not sad, not scared, angry. These people had taken my husband, my home, my savings, my reputation. Now they were trying to take my job. And for what? Because I had the audacity to stand up for myself? Because I refused to disappear quietly? I was done being a victim. It was time to start being a fighter. I found a women's support group at a local community center. It met twice a week in the basement of a church, led by a woman named Denise Foster. Denise was in her mid-40s, with no-nonsense eyes and a voice that commanded attention. She had escaped an abusive marriage 10 years ago and dedicated her life to helping other women do the same. She did not coddle. She educated. At my first meeting, she asked how many women in the room had their own copies of important documents: birth certificates, social security cards, marriage licenses, tax returns from the last 5 years. Most of us shook our heads. Denise nodded grimly. She gave us homework. First, get copies of everything. Second, open a bank account in only your name, even if it only has $20 in it. Third, document your children's routines. Who takes them to school? Who makes their meals? Who goes to doctor's appointments? Custody battles are about proving who the primary caregiver actually is. I took notes furiously. Another woman in the group spoke up. Her name was Sandra, a quiet woman in her 50s, with sad eyes. She said she had believed, for 22 years, that she could not survive without him, that she was nothing. When he finally left her for someone younger, she was terrified. But then she realized something. She said she was already doing everything: cooking, cleaning, working, managing the household. She was already surviving. She just did not know it yet. Something shifted inside me when I heard those words. I had spent so much time feeling helpless, feeling like I needed David's approval, David's support, David's permission to exist. But the truth was, I had been carrying our household for years. I had been the one paying bills, tracking expenses, maintaining our life, while David worked late and checked his phone and pretended to be overwhelmed by his important career. I was already surviving. I just needed to realize it. I stopped thinking like a victim. I started thinking like an investigator. My job had trained me for this without my realizing it. 8 years in hospital billing meant 8 years of tracking down discrepancies, following paper trails, catching fraudulent charges. The same skills that made me good at my job could help me fight for my life. I started building files. File 1 was about the text messages. I had already proved they were sent when I could not have sent them. Now I dug deeper. The payments to Text Secure had started 3 months before Christmas. David had been planning this ambush for months. File 2 was about the finances. David had never changed the password on our online banking. Arrogance or oversight, it worked in my favor. I logged in and screenshotted everything before he could lock me out. What I found made my blood run cold. Payments to a private investigator starting 8 months before Christmas. Payments to a divorce lawyer starting 6 months before Christmas. Regular transfers to an account I did not recognize. David had been preparing to destroy me for almost a year. Our whole pregnancy, every time he touched my belly and smiled about our future, he had been planning to throw me away. File 3 was about Brittany. I started researching her background, looking for connections, trying to understand how she fit into the picture. And I found something interesting. Brittany's sister worked at my hospital, in administration, the same department that had received the billing complaints against me. The pieces started coming together. I brought my evidence to legal aid. A young attorney named James Whitfield agreed to take my case. He was in his late 20s, idealistic and eager, the kind of lawyer who still believed in justice. He reviewed my documentation with growing amazement. He said it was incredible. He said I had basically done his job for me. He said the spoofed texts alone were grounds for sanctions against David's attorney. We filed motions. We prepared for a hearing. We built a case that would prove fraud, coercion, and harassment. Judge Patricia Hartwell presided over our hearing. She was in her mid-50s, sharp and no-nonsense, with a reputation for seeing through manipulation. James presented our evidence methodically. The spoofed text messages, David's payments to the spoofing service, the timeline proving I could not have sent those texts, the pattern of harassment including the housing complaint against Marcus and the job complaints against me. Judge Hartwell's expression grew increasingly severe as she listened. She threw out all evidence related to the fake affair. She issued sanctions against David's lawyer for submitting fraudulent evidence. She granted me temporary full custody of our unborn child. She ordered David to pay my legal fees. I hugged James in the hallway afterward. I called my mother. I called Marcus. I felt like I could finally breathe again. I thought I had won. I thought the nightmare was finally over. 3 days later, James called me with news that destroyed everything. His voice was strained. He said David had filed something new. He said I needed to come in immediately. At the legal aid office, James looked physically ill. He said they were claiming I was mentally unstable. He said they had documentation. He said they had my medical records. I went cold. My medical records were supposed to be private, HIPAA protected. No one should have been able to access them without my consent. James showed me what David's lawyer had submitted. 5 years ago, after my father died, I had struggled with depression. I saw a therapist for 6 months. I took antidepressants for a year. I got better. But in David's filing, those 6 months of grief became evidence of chronic mental illness. A doctor at my hospital, the same one connected to David's contract, had submitted a statement claiming I exhibited erratic behavior and paranoid ideation. I was not just fighting for my marriage anymore. I was fighting for my right to be seen as sane. And that night, my body betrayed me. The stress was too much. 7.5 months pregnant, exhausted, terrified, alone in a motel room with no one to help me, I went into premature labor. The ambulance ride was a blur of sirens and bright lights. The paramedics asked questions I could barely process. How far along was I? When did the contractions start? Did I have anyone they should call? I gave them Marcus's number. I prayed he would answer. At the hospital, they rushed me into labor and delivery. Doctors and nurses moved around me in choreographed urgency. Someone was explaining what was happening, but the words did not make sense through the fog of fear and pain. And then Linda Coleman walked into my room. She was wearing a tasteful gray suit. Her hair was perfect. Her makeup was immaculate. She looked like she was arriving for a business meeting, not visiting her son's estranged wife in premature labor. She sat down beside my bed and patted my hand. Her voice was that same honey-sweet poison I remembered from Christmas Eve. She said, "Poor dear." She said I had been through so much. She said all this stress must be terrible for the baby. I told her to get out. She smiled serenely. She said she was just there to help. She said she had always only wanted to help me. But I made it so difficult. All this fighting, all this stress. A judge might wonder if I was really prioritizing my child's well-being. I understood what she was doing. She was documenting this visit. She would use my hostile response as evidence of my instability. She leaned closer. She told me to sign the papers. She said David would be a wonderful father. She said I could visit whenever I liked. Supervised, of course, given my history. My monitor started beeping. My blood pressure was spiking. A nurse rushed in and asked Linda to leave. Linda stood smoothly, adjusting her purse on her shoulder. She said she would let me rest. She said I should think about what was best for my daughter. Then she walked out, leaving me alone and terrified and more determined than ever to destroy her. My daughter was born at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday in February. She came 6 weeks early, weighing just 4 pounds and 8 ounces. They took her to the neonatal intensive care unit before I could hold her. I named her Hope. It was the only name that made sense. For 2 days, I could only watch her through the glass of her incubator. She was so tiny, so fragile, surrounded by tubes and wires and machines that beeped and hummed. But she was breathing. She was fighting. She was alive. On the 3rd day, they finally let me hold her. She was so light in my arms. so impossibly small. Her fingers curled around my pinky, and she looked up at me with dark eyes that seemed to see right through to my soul. I whispered promises to her. I promised to protect her. I promised to fight for her. I promised that no one would ever take her away from me. I had no idea how soon those promises would be tested. While I was still in the hospital, recovering from childbirth, David's lawyer filed for emergency custody. The filing cited my medical emergency as evidence that I could not care for a child. It cited my history of mental health treatment. It cited the ongoing investigation into my job performance. It painted a picture of a woman spiraling out of control, a danger to herself and others. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. I would have to defend my right to keep my daughter while still recovering from giving birth. And then the third disaster hit. My mother had a stroke. She was in the hospital in Florida, alive but incapacitated. She could not speak. She could not move her right side. She might never fully recover. I wanted to go to her. I wanted to hold her hand and tell her everything would be okay. But I could not leave the state while custody proceedings were pending. If I left, I would forfeit my rights. I sat in the NICU watching my daughter through the glass, knowing my mother was alone in a hospital 1,000 miles away, and I had never felt so helpless in my life. This was rock bottom. True rock bottom. Deeper than Christmas Eve. Deeper than the laundromat. Deeper than the motel room where I had cried myself to sleep. I had nothing left. No energy, no hope, no fight. And then a nurse changed everything. Her name was Patrice Williams. She was in her 40s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. She had been checking on Hope regularly, adjusting monitors and changing dressings with practiced efficiency. One night, when I was sitting alone by the incubator, she pulled up a chair beside me. She asked if I was the one fighting the Coleman boy. I tensed. Even nurses were talking about my case, but Patrice's voice was sympathetic, not judgmental. She said her sister dated him 10 years ago, before me. I looked up sharply. Patrice nodded. She said he did the same thing to her sister, got her pregnant, then decided he wanted out, told everyone she was crazy. His mama made her life hell. She said her sister signed away custody just to make it stop. I asked what happened to her. Patrice's expression was sad. She said her sister sees her son every other weekend now. David's mama raises him, tells him his real mama did not want him. She handed me a piece of paper with a phone number written on it. She said this was her sister's number. Her name was Vanessa. She had been waiting 12 years for someone to fight Linda Coleman. She had documented stories, evidence. I took the paper with trembling hands. I was not David's first victim. I was just the latest. But I could be the last. I called Vanessa the next day. She answered on the second ring, like she had been waiting for years for this call. And in a way, she had been. Her story was devastatingly familiar. She had met David when she was 23. He was charming, attentive, everything she thought she wanted. They dated for 2 years. She got pregnant. He proposed. And then everything changed. David became distant, cold, critical. He found fault with everything she did. He made her feel stupid and worthless and lucky to have him. When she was 7 months pregnant, his mother came to visit. Linda sat her down and explained that Vanessa was not suitable for the Coleman family. She was too emotional, too uneducated, too poor. She would never fit in. It would be better for everyone, especially the baby, if Vanessa stepped aside gracefully. Vanessa refused at first, but then the harassment started. Complaints to her employer. Rumors spread to her friends. Anonymous tips to Child Protective Services about her fitness as a mother. By the time her son was 6 months old, Vanessa was so beaten down that she signed away primary custody just to make it stop. She had regretted it every day since. I asked her if she had documentation. evidence. Anything I could use. She laughed bitterly. She said she had 12 years of documentation, every incident recorded, every manipulation cataloged, every lie tracked and time-stamped. She had been waiting for someone strong enough to use it. I told her I was not strong. I was tired and scared and barely holding on. She said that was exactly what Linda counted on. She said strong was not about feeling fearless. Strong was about fighting when you were terrified. Strong was about refusing to quit even when everything told you to give up. She said she had not been strong enough 12 years ago. But maybe together, we could be strong enough now. I spent the next week building my case. Vanessa's documentation was meticulous. 12 years of records showing the same patterns I had experienced, the same manipulation tactics, the same harassment campaigns, the same gaslighting and isolation. It was not just me being paranoid. It was a pattern, a system, a playbook that Linda had used for decades. I reached out to 2 other women I found through social media, women who had dated David briefly before breaking things off when they sensed something was wrong. They had smaller stories, fewer details, but their experiences added to the pattern. And then I reached out to Brittany. I know what you are thinking. Why would I contact the woman who had helped destroy my marriage? The woman who was carrying what might be my husband's child? Because something Denise had said stuck with me. Abusers follow patterns. They are not creative. They are repetitive. If someone is targeting you, they have probably targeted others before. Brittany was not my enemy. She was just the next victim. I sent her a message, just the facts. I told her David had told her I was abusive. I showed her what really happened. I gave her my evidence. I said if she wanted to talk, I was there. If she did not, I understood. She did not respond for 3 days. Then she called, crying. She said David told her I hit him. He showed her pictures of bruises. He said I was violent and unstable, and he feared for his life. I told her to look up self-inflicted injuries, domestic abuse. I told her to see what she found. She went quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Oh my God." Over the next 2 weeks, Brittany and I had several conversations. She was not ready to turn against David completely. She was scared. She was pregnant with what she thought was his child. She did not know who to trust. But she started asking questions. She started paying attention. She started noticing things she had missed before. And then she told me something that changed everything. She said Linda came to her 6 months before she even met David. Linda said her son was in a difficult marriage and needed support. Linda suggested Brittany apply for a job at David's company. Linda had placed Brittany in David's path. She had orchestrated the affair from the very beginning. It was not just David who was targeting me. It was not even just Linda. It was a system, a machine designed to identify vulnerable women, extract whatever value they offered, and then discard them. And I was going to tear the whole thing down. While I built my case against David, I also investigated how he had gotten my medical records. HIPAA violations are serious. Medical providers can face massive fines for unauthorized disclosure of patient information. Whoever had accessed my records without my consent had broken federal law. I filed a formal complaint with the Office for Civil Rights. They launched an investigation. What they found confirmed everything I suspected. Someone at my hospital had accessed my psychiatric records 3 days before David's lawyer submitted them to the court. The access was unauthorized. It came from a terminal in the administrative office, the same administrative office where Brittany's sister worked. Her name was Jennifer Hayes. She had worked at the hospital for 5 years. She had access to patient records as part of her job, and she had used that access to pull my mental health history and give it to her sister's boyfriend. Jennifer was terminated immediately. The hospital faced a significant fine for inadequate access controls, and David's lawyer was facing disciplinary action for using illegally obtained evidence. But that was not all I found. While investigating the medical records breach, I discovered something about the billing complaints that had gotten me placed on administrative leave. The complaints were fake. They cited specific dates and amounts, but when investigators checked the actual billing records, no errors existed. The complaints had been fabricated, created by someone with access to the billing system who knew enough to make them look real, someone like Jennifer Hayes. The investigation cleared me completely. I was reinstated at my job with back pay for the weeks I had missed, and I had even more evidence of the coordinated harassment campaign against me. My case file was growing thicker by the day, but I still needed one more piece of evidence, something that would tie everything together, something that would prove beyond any doubt that Linda Coleman had orchestrated this entire conspiracy. I found it in the most unlikely place. David had never changed the password on our streaming account. I logged in one night, not really sure what I was looking for, just checking to see if there was anything useful, and I found a shared folder. David had been using the streaming service's cloud storage feature to share documents with his mother, planning documents, strategy memos, timelines for the divorce, scripts for what to say to me and when to say it. Everything laid out in black and white. There was a document titled Rachel Exit Strategy, dated from 10 months before Christmas. It outlined the plan to catch me in a fake affair, present evidence at Christmas dinner, force me to sign papers while in shock, and take custody of the baby. There was a document titled Brittany Placement, dated from 8 months before Christmas. It outlined how to introduce Brittany to David's workplace, how to facilitate their relationship, and how to use her pregnancy as additional leverage against me. There was even a document titled Vanessa Reference that noted the successful tactics used against David's previous girlfriend and recommended repeating them with modifications for my specific vulnerabilities. Linda Coleman had put her conspiracy in writing, and I had access to all of it. I screenshotted everything. I saved it to multiple locations. I printed hard copies and stored them in 3 different places. Then I started planning my counterattack. I requested a mediation session. My lawyer, James, was confused. We were winning on every front. The custody agreement had been voided. The fake evidence had been thrown out. David was facing sanctions and possible criminal charges for the HIPAA violation. Why would I want to mediate? I told him I wanted to see their faces when they realized they had lost. I wanted to look Linda in the eyes and show her that I knew everything. I wanted to give David one chance to walk away before I destroyed him completely. James was skeptical, but he agreed to set up the meeting. The mediation took place in a conference room at the courthouse. Present were me, James, David, David's lawyer, Linda, and a court-appointed mediator named Margaret Sullivan. David looked terrible. He had lost weight. His expensive suit hung loosely on his frame. His eyes were bloodshot and shadowed. Linda looked exactly the same as always, perfectly composed, perfectly confident, certain that whatever was about to happen, she would find a way to spin it to her advantage. She had no idea what was coming. The mediator asked me what resolution I was seeking. I said I wanted to share some information that might help us reach an understanding. I opened my folder. I presented the evidence one piece at a time. The spoofed text messages with payment records showing David had paid for the service. The HIPAA violation investigation showing Jennifer Hayes had illegally accessed my medical records at David's request. The fake billing complaints traced back to the same administrative terminal. Statements from Vanessa Williams and 2 other women, documenting the same patterns of manipulation over more than a decade. Financial records showing David had been paying Linda $2,000 a month for years while claiming to be struggling financially. And finally, the documents from the streaming account. The exit strategy, the placement plan, the reference to previous successful campaigns against other women. Everything laid out in meticulous detail. The room went silent. David's face had gone white. His hands were shaking. His lawyer looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Linda's composure finally cracked. Her voice was sharp, desperate. She said these records were obtained illegally. She said I could not use them. She said this was entrapment and harassment and I would be facing charges of my own. I smiled. I said the phone records were available to the account holder. The bank statements were from our joint account. The HIPAA investigation was public record, and the streaming account was in David's name with a password I was authorized to use. Everything was obtained legally. Everything was documented. Everything was admissible. I turned to David. I told him I was going to give him a choice, the same choice he gave me on Christmas Eve. I slid a document across the table. I said, sign this. Joint custody, no child support, either direction. We each walk away and start over. David looked at the paper like it was a live grenade. He asked why he would sign that. He said he was going to win. I shook my head. I said no, he was not. Because if he did not sign this, I was sending everything to 3 places. The district attorney, Social Security's fraud division, because Linda had been collecting disability for a back injury that did not prevent her from lifting 30-pound boxes of Christmas decorations, and every news outlet that covered family court corruption stories. I turned to Linda. I told her I found something fascinating about her. She had planned this for years. She placed Brittany in David's path. She coached him on how to manipulate me. She orchestrated the Christmas ambush. She committed federal fraud to maintain her lifestyle. But she made one mistake. Linda's voice was barely controlled. She asked what mistake. I said she taught me how thorough you have to be. I learned from watching her. I just did it better. The room was silent for a long moment. Then David picked up the pen and signed. The weeks after the mediation were strange. I had won, completely definitively won. But victory did not feel the way I expected. I thought I would feel triumphant, vindicated, powerful. Instead, I felt tired, bone-deep exhausted from months of fighting, empty from the sustained terror and rage that had been fueling me. And beneath the tiredness, something else, a small, quiet grief for the life I thought I had, for the husband I thought I loved, for the future I thought we would share. David moved out of our house within a week of the mediation. I chose not to move back in. Too many bad memories in those walls. Instead, I found a small apartment on the other side of the town, close to Marcus's place and close to my work. It was modest, 2 bedrooms, one for me and one for Hope. A small kitchen where I taught myself to cook for one. A living room with a second-hand couch and a view of a parking lot. It was mine. That was what mattered. Hope came home from the NICU 3 weeks after the mediation. She was still small, still fragile, but she was growing stronger every day. The doctors said she would be fine, no lasting effects from her early arrival. I held her every chance I got. I memorized the weight of her in my arms. I whispered stories to her while she slept, telling her about the grandmother in Florida who loved her, even though they had never met. About the great-grandmother, Gloria, who had fed us ham on Christmas Day. About the mother who would never, ever let anyone take her away. David had visitation rights per our agreement, every other weekend. He showed up about half the time. When he did show up, he was awkward and uncertain, like he did not know how to hold his own daughter. Hope cried when he took her. I pretended not to notice. Linda was under investigation for disability fraud. Her carefully constructed reputation in the community was crumbling. The church friends who used to cluster around her at social events now pretended not to see her. The neighbors who had accepted her cookies and praised her generosity, now whispered behind her back. She had spent decades building an image of herself as a devoted mother, a generous neighbor, a pillar of the community. I had torn that image down in one afternoon. I wish I could say it made me feel better. It did not. Revenge, it turns out, is a surprisingly empty meal. Brittany reached out to me a month after the mediation. She had gotten a DNA test. The baby she was carrying was not David's. She had been seeing someone else before David, a man named Kevin, who she had broken up with when David came along. The timing was tight, but the genetics were clear. Kevin was the father. She and Kevin were trying to work things out. She was not sure if it would last, but she was hopeful, and she wanted me to know that she was sorry. Sorry for being used against me. Sorry for not seeing the truth sooner. I told her I was not angry at her. She was a victim too, just one who got out before the trap closed completely. We were not friends. We would probably never be friends. But there was something like understanding between us now, a mutual recognition of what we had both survived. My mother recovered slowly from her stroke. She regained some movement, some speech. She was not the woman she had been, but she was alive and improving. I flew down to see her as soon as the custody agreement was finalized, bringing Hope to meet her grandmother for the first time. She cried when she held Hope, tears streaming down her face, one arm wrapped around my daughter, the other too weak to move. She said she was proud of me. She said she always knew I was stronger than I realized. I cried too. Marcus got promoted at the hospital, used his raise to take Gloria on a cruise. She came back with a tan and a collection of increasingly outrageous stories about the things she had said to the cruise staff. I went back to work, took on extra shifts, started teaching a documentation workshop at Denise's support group. Women who were going through what I had been through, learning the skills I had learned the hard way. Denise called me one day with news that changed everything. She said they had gotten a grant. They were expanding the program, and she wanted me to help run it. I told her I would think about it. She said I would say yes. I just did not know it yet. 1 year after my Christmas Eve ambush, I stood in the community center teaching a workshop on family court survival. The room was full of women at various stages of their own battles. Some were just beginning, still raw and terrified. Some were in the middle, exhausted and desperate for any advantage. Some were near the end, able to see light at the horizon, but not quite there yet. I taught them what I had learned. Document everything. Get copies of important documents. Open a bank account in only your name. Learn your rights. Build your network. I told them they were not alone. They were not crazy. They were not done. After the workshop, a woman lingered near the door. She was in her late 50s, with gray hair and anxious eyes. Something about her seemed familiar, though I could not place why. She introduced herself as Catherine. She said she needed to talk to me about my daughter. I tensed immediately. After everything I had been through, a stranger approaching me about Hope triggered every defensive instinct I had. But Catherine held up her hands peacefully. She said she was not there to cause trouble. She was there because she was David's real mother. I stared at her. She explained. Linda was David's stepmother, not his biological mother. Catherine and David's father had divorced when David was 3 years old. Linda had waged a custody campaign against Catherine using the exact same tactics I had experienced. Fake evidence, medical records, harassment, isolation. Catherine had lost. Linda made the supervised visits so unpleasant that Catherine eventually stopped coming. David grew up believing Linda was his mother, and Catherine had abandoned him. She had not spoken to her son in over 30 years. She had seen news coverage of my case. The local paper had run a story about the custody battle and the fraud investigation. When she saw the name Coleman, when she read about Linda's tactics, she knew she had to reach out. She handed me a folder. She said this was everything she had documented 30 years ago. Every incident, every manipulation, every lie. She had been waiting 3 decades for someone to believe her. I opened the folder and started reading. The patterns were identical, the same playbook I had experienced, used against a different woman a generation earlier. The same cruelty, the same calculation, the same systematic destruction of anyone who threatened Linda's control. Linda had not just targeted me. She had not just targeted Vanessa. She had been doing this for more than 30 years. At least 4 women that we knew of. Probably more. She was not just a difficult mother-in-law. She was a serial abuser who had perfected her techniques over decades. I looked up at Catherine. I asked her why she was telling me this now. She said because she spent 20 years believing she had lost her son forever. But when she saw me win, when she saw that Linda could actually be beaten, she realized she had given up too soon. She was not looking for sympathy. She was looking for justice. I thought about everything I had learned over the past year, about documentation, about patterns, about building networks of survivors. I thought about Hope, who would grow up knowing her worth, who would never learn that her value depended on someone else's approval. I thought about David, who had been 3 years old when Linda stole him from his real mother, who had been raised by a manipulator and taught to become a manipulator himself, who was, in some ways, as much a victim as anyone else. I did not forgive him. I was not sure I ever would, but I understood him a little better now. I made a decision. I asked Catherine if she would like to help me teach a workshop about documentation. Tears welled in her eyes. She said she would like that very much. We started the Coleman Survivors Network 3 months later. Catherine and Vanessa and me teaching other women what we had learned by documenting patterns, building cases, fighting back against systems designed to destroy them. The work was hard, exhausting, sometimes heartbreaking when women we were helping lost their battles despite everything. But it was meaningful. It was real. It was something I could point to and say, this matters. This is why I survived. This is what all that pain was for. I still thought about David sometimes, wondered if he would ever understand what his mother had done to him, wondered if he would ever break free of her influence and become someone different. I did not hold out much hope, but stranger things had happened. Hope turned 2 years old on a sunny Tuesday in February. We had a small party at Marcus's apartment. Gloria made a cake. Denise came. Catherine came. Vanessa brought her son. Now a teenager named Marcus Jr., who David had never bothered to see. Hope ran around the apartment on sturdy toddler legs, laughing at everything, delighted by balloons and candles and cake. She had my eyes and David's chin and a personality all her own. She would never know her father as anything but a distant figure who showed up sometimes and forgot about her most of the time. She would grow up in a small apartment with a working mother who was often tired and stressed. But she would also grow up knowing she was loved, knowing she was enough, knowing that her worth did not depend on anyone else's approval or permission or validation. She would grow up strong. I watched her blow out her candles, cheeks puffed with effort, and I felt something I had not felt in a long time. Peace, not happiness exactly. Happiness felt too simple for what I had been through. But peace? Acceptance? A sense that despite everything, I had ended up exactly where I was supposed to be. I spent 34 years believing I was not enough, that I needed someone else to complete me, that my worth depended on who loved me. I was wrong. My worth was always there. I just had to stop letting people who did not deserve me convince me it was not. If you are listening to this, and you are in the middle of your own fight, I want you to know something. You are not alone. You are not crazy. And you are not done. Document everything. Build your network. Learn your rights. And never, ever sign anything in the moment. The greatest revenge is not making them suffer. The greatest revenge is building a life so full of purpose that they become nothing but a footnote in your story. My name is Rachel Coleman, and I am just getting started. 4 years after my Christmas Eve ambush, I stood at a podium in a conference room at the state capitol. I was testifying before the legislature about family court reform, about the patterns of abuse I had documented, about the women who had lost everything because no one believed them until it was too late. Behind me sat Catherine and Vanessa and 20 other women, all survivors, all fighters, all living proof that the system could be beaten. We were pushing for 3 specific changes to state law: better protection for victims of manufactured evidence, stronger penalties for HIPAA violations in custody cases, and mandatory training for family court judges on recognizing patterns of domestic manipulation. The legislators listened politely. Some of them seemed genuinely interested. Others clearly just wanted us to finish so they could move on to more important business. I did not care if they were bored. I was not there to entertain them. I was there to change things. After my testimony, a young woman approached me in the hallway. She was maybe 25, with tired eyes and the hunted look I remembered seeing in my own mirror years ago. She said she was going through something. She said she found my story online. She said she thought she might need help. I gave her my card. I told her to call me. I told her she was not alone. I told her we would figure this out together. She thanked me with tears in her eyes and walked away. I watched her go and thought about the woman I had been 4 years ago, crying on a bench in a laundromat on Christmas Eve, believing I had lost everything, wondering if I would survive. I survived. I did more than survive. I built something that would last long after I was gone. Not because I was special. Not because I was rich or connected or brilliant. Because I refused to quit. That is the only superpower that matters. The refusal to stay down. You have it too. You just might not know it yet, but you will. Trust me, you will. If this story touched your heart, I have one small favor to ask. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. It tells me you want more stories like this. Stories about strength. Stories about survival. Stories about women who refuse to break. Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Have you ever had to walk away from someone who did not deserve you? Have you ever been underestimated and proved them wrong? Your story matters too, and I read every single comment. If you know someone who needs to hear this message today, someone who is struggling, someone who feels trapped, someone who has forgotten their own worth, please share this video with them. You might be the reason they find the courage to fight back. And if this story helped you feel less alone, hit that like button. It costs nothing, but means everything to this channel. Thank you for staying with me. Thank you for being part of this community. Until next time, take care of yourself. Document everything. And remember, you deserve relationships that honor your full humanity, not just the parts that serve someone else's agenda. I will see you in the next one. Closing disclaimer: this content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with real-life lessons. Every detail was crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our viewers. We believe stories have the power to heal, to teach, and to remind us all that no matter how dark things get, there is always a way forward. Thank you for trusting us with your time.